At first glance, the housing market still looks normal. Listings are active, prices are visible, and conversations sound optimistic enough to feel familiar. Agents still talk about demand. Homes still get showings. Nothing appears broken. And that surface normalcy is exactly where the blind spot lives, because when you look longer, something subtle feels off. Interest doesn't convert the way it used to. Buyers show up, ask thoughtful questions, then step back instead of leaning in. Sellers wait comfortably, assuming time is neutral, while momentum quietly thins underneath them. The market hasn't fallen. It has paused. That pause confuses people because we're trained to watch the wrong signals. We're taught that prices tell the truth. If numbers haven't dropped, nothing must be wrong. But markets don't turn when prices move. They turn when behavior does. And behavior has already shifted in ways that don't announce themselves loudly. If you've been watching closely, you've likely sensed this before you could explain it. Showings without offers. Interest without urgency. Buyers who qualify but don't commit. Sellers who feel resistance they can't quite name. Nothing dramatic is happening, yet decisions feel heavier than they should. That tension isn't random. It's information. The real shift isn't inventory or affordability yet. It's psychology. Buyers aren't reacting to listings the same way. They aren't competing reflexively. They aren't assuming tomorrow will punish hesitation. They're slowing down, verifying, protecting optionality. Not because they're scared, but because they've learned patience no longer carries the same penalty. This is the part most homeowners miss. Demand can exist without converting. Activity can exist without momentum. A market can look healthy while quietly losing decisiveness. When that happens, traditional signals stop working. Past cycles, old instincts, and familiar reassurance no longer map cleanly onto outcomes. None of this means collapse. There's no alarm here. It means the environment has changed before the numbers have. And when psychology changes first, outcomes follow later, often catching people off guard. If this feels familiar, you're not behind. You're early. You're noticing the gap between how the market looks and how buyers are starting to behave. That awareness matters because buyer behavior always shifts before prices do. Seeing this early doesn't demand action, only attention, patience, and the willingness to question familiar assumptions before the market forces that realization through pressure later onward. Subscribe and hit the bell. Buyer behavior changes before prices do. The buyer most homeowners are waiting for doesn't exist anymore. Not because demand vanished, but because the psychology that once drove decisions has changed. Many sellers are still anchored to an old buyer profile, one shaped by urgency, fear of missing out, and the belief that hesitation carried punishment. That buyer moved fast, competed reflexively, and treated speed as safety. Today's buyer does not. The old buyer was conditioned by repetition. Lose one home, rush the next. Miss a showing, escalate the offer. Waive protections to feel chosen. That behavior wasn't reckless. It was adaptive to an environment where waiting meant losing. Sellers learned to read that urgency as seriousness. Showings converted quickly. Interest became leverage. Signals were loud and reliable. But that conditioning broke when waiting stopped being dangerous. The modern buyer has lived through volatility. Rates moved. Prices surged. Narratives flipped. Experience replaced instinct. Buyers learned that speed doesn't guarantee safety, and winning doesn't guarantee comfort. That lesson rewired priorities quietly. Today's buyer looks the same on the surface. They still tour homes. They still save listings. They still ask smart questions. Online activity remains high. Showings still happen. But the internal decision process has changed completely. Verification replaced velocity. Optionality replaced competition. Buyers now assume tomorrow will still offer choices, so they protect flexibility instead of rushing to secure it. This is why traditional signals no longer predict outcomes. Showings don't mean offers. Clicks don't mean commitment. Positive feedback doesn't mean momentum. Sellers interpret interest through an outdated lens, expecting old behavior to follow familiar patterns. When it doesn't, confusion sets in. The modern buyer isn't indecisive. They're deliberate. They want alignment, not adrenaline. They read disclosures carefully. They run numbers twice. They imagine worst-case scenarios without panic. They pause not because they're unsure about the home, but because they're sure they don't need to rush. That shift disrupts seller identity. Homeowners still believe demand behaves the way it used to, because that belief once worked. Letting go of it feels like surrendering ground. But clinging to old rules doesn't restore momentum. It delays adjustment while buyer behavior keeps moving forward. This isn't a temporary mood swing. It's a structural change in how decisions get made. Buyers have learned patience works. Once learned, that lesson doesn't unlearn easily. Markets can't force urgency back into a system that no longer punishes waiting. Recognizing this is uncomfortable, but it's clarifying. The game didn't end. The rules changed, and sellers who keep waiting for the old buyer are waiting for a signal that no longer arrives. Stay with us. This shift isn't temporary. Buyers today are optimizing for something very different than sellers expect. They are no longer chasing the fastest path to ownership. They are optimizing for flexibility, reversibility, and emotional safety. That shift explains almost every confusing signal sellers are seeing right now, if you know how to read it. Modern buyers aren't asking, "How do I win this home?" They're asking, "How do I avoid being trapped?" That question quietly governs every decision. Can I exit if my job changes? Can I refinance without regret? Can I live with this choice if conditions shift again? These aren't fearful questions. They're intelligent ones formed by experience. Speed used to feel protective. Acting fast meant securing certainty before someone else took it away. Now speed feels risky. Moving quickly increases the chance of missing something irreversible. Buyers learned that patience creates leverage, not loss. Waiting doesn't cost them options anymore. It preserves them. This is where sellers misread hesitation. They assume buyers are nervous or unserious. In reality, buyers are running internal simulations. They're testing downside scenarios quietly, long before making emotional commitments. They want room to adapt, not pressure to perform. Optionality has replaced urgency as the primary goal. Buyers want choices to remain open after the transaction, not just before it. They're measuring how much freedom a purchase preserves, not how impressive the offer looks. That's why competition feels muted. Winning matters less than not overcommitting. Loss aversion plays a powerful role here. Buyers feel the pain of a bad decision more intensely than the pleasure of a good one. Overpaying, getting locked into unfavorable terms, or discovering hidden costs feel permanent. Waiting feels reversible. That imbalance makes restraint feel rational, not timid. Psychological safety matters more than excitement now. Buyers want to sleep at night knowing they can adjust if life changes. Stability of terms, clarity of costs, and confidence in exit paths create comfort. Without those, even attractive homes feel heavy. This explains why emotional attachment happens later, not earlier. Buyers delay bonding with a property until certainty replaces ambiguity. They protect themselves from disappointment by staying detached. Sellers interpret this as lack of interest, but it's actually self-regulation. What looks like indecision is disciplined filtering. Buyers are narrowing risk, not avoiding commitment. They are adapting to an environment that taught them flexibility outlasts optimism. Once you see this pattern, buyer behavior stops feeling random. It becomes predictable. And when behavior becomes predictable, outcomes become manageable. Sellers who understand this stop chasing urgency and start aligning with how decisions are actually made now. If this reframes buyers for you, hit the bell. Silence feels reassuring to homeowners because it resembles control. Showings happen, messages arrive, agents sound calm, and nothing overtly negative appears. That quiet gets mistaken for strength. If buyers were truly uneasy, sellers assumed they would say so. Instead, the silence masks hesitation, not confidence, and that misunderstanding reshapes outcomes. Activity without commitment creates a dangerous illusion. Views, clicks, showings, and conversations suggest demand, yet none require decision. Social proof is here. Attention no longer signals desire. It signals evaluation. Buyers gather information without revealing intent, while sellers interpret motion as validation, unaware the crowd is no longer leaning forward. Time on market is often dismissed as neutral, but it carries memory. Each extra week reframes a listing from opportunity to question. Buyers wonder who passed and why. Silence becomes information. What once felt exclusive begins to feel available, and availability shifts leverage away from the homeowner without announcement publicly. Late-stage deal failures deepen the illusion. Contracts form, optimism rises, then dissolves after inspections or financing. Sellers blame bad luck. Buyers absorb caution. Each collapse trains the next buyer to slow down. Confidence erodes silently, not because homes are flawed, but because trust in smooth outcomes no longer exists today. Polite disengagement is another misunderstood signal. Buyers don't reject, they drift. Email slow. Follow-up soften. Feedback stays kind but vague. Homeowners interpret courtesy as interest, unaware politeness is now a protective boundary. Silence becomes the safest way for buyers to exit without confrontation or emotional cost to everyone involved here. This is where assumptions quietly fail. Sellers believe no news is good news. In reality, no news often means no urgency. Buyers aren't negotiating yet because they're still deciding whether engagement is worth the risk. The absence of pressure signals optionality, not confidence, and optionality favors the patient buyer side. The fear comes later, not now. It arrives when sellers realize time worked against them, when comparable homes closed lower, when flexibility vanished. Silence felt calm until it demanded action. By then, choices narrowed quietly, and decisions felt heavier because the market had already adjusted while nothing was said aloud. This isn't a warning meant to scare. It's a correction of interpretation. Silence is not strength. Activity without commitment isn't demand. Understanding that earlier preserves control later. Homeowners who listen to behavior instead of noise respond with clarity, not panic, and keep leverage while others wait too long to adjust. Subscribe. Silence is not confidence. For most sellers, this shift doesn't hurt their wallet first. It hurts their sense of self. A home isn't just an asset. It's a memory, a milestone, a reflection of good decisions made at the right time. The last strong offer or P-valuation becomes more than data. It becomes proof that they understood the market, that they timed life correctly, that the story they tell themselves still holds. That's why anchoring bias feels so powerful here. Sellers anchor to a number that once felt fair and achievable, and every quiet week that follows feels temporary rather than informative. Waiting feels safer than adjusting because waiting preserves identity. Adjusting feels like admitting the past no longer applies. Nothing external forces a change yet, so the mind protects itself by assuming time will restore clarity. This is where confusion replaces fear. There's no obvious danger, no dramatic rejection. Showings still happen. Conversations remain polite. Agents speak carefully. Sellers sense resistance but can't locate the threat. The market hasn't said no. It just hasn't said yes. That ambiguity is emotionally draining because humans are wired to respond to clear signals, not prolonged uncertainty. Loss aversion deepens the stall. The pain of accepting less than the peak feels heavier than the abstract risk of waiting longer. Even when logic suggests flexibility, emotion argues for patience. Sellers tell themselves they're being disciplined, not delayed. Each small pause feels harmless, but those pauses accumulate into leverage, quietly shifting away. What makes this phase dangerous is how reasonable it feels. Sellers aren't being reckless. They're protecting themselves from regret. They're avoiding a decision that feels irreversible. But while they wait, buyers adapt. They grow more selective. They test boundaries. They learn that time is on their side. No confrontation occurs. Power simply moves. This erosion doesn't show up on a spreadsheet at first. It shows up in tone, in longer negotiations, in buyers asking for more, not because they're greedy, but because they can. Sellers feel this as friction, not failure, which makes it easier to dismiss. Yet each concession requested later costs more than an early adjustment would have. There's empathy here, not judgment. Most sellers have never experienced a market that punishes waiting emotionally before it does financially. They expect danger to arrive loudly. Instead, it arrives as silence and uncertainty. By the time the emotional discomfort turns into urgency, leverage has already changed sides. Understanding this reframes the moment. The threat isn't loss, it's delay. Not because prices collapse overnight, but because options narrow quietly. Sellers who recognize this early don't panic. They regain agency. They make decisions from clarity rather than confusion. That shift doesn't protect ego, but it preserves control, which matters far more. This is the moment where awareness becomes power. The market isn't attacking sellers, it's inviting them to respond differently. Those who wait for certainty feel pressure later. Those who act with understanding keep choice. Hit the bell. This is where leverage quietly changes sides. This emotional lag is why many sellers misjudge timing. They wait for discomfort to become obvious, but markets rarely provide clarity. They move quietly, rewarding awareness over endurance. Recognizing emotional friction early is not weakness. It is literacy. It allows sellers to respond deliberately instead of reacting late when choices feel constrained. When buyer behavior shifts, the advantage doesn't go to the loudest or the fastest. It moves quietly toward those who adapt first. These are the sellers who stop arguing with the market and start listening to it. They notice hesitation early, not as rejection, but as information. Instead of defending yesterday's price, they clarify today's terms. That realism doesn't weaken them, it restores motion, and motion is control. Prepared buyers adapt just as quickly. They aren't frozen or fearful. They're selective. They arrive with financing ready, questions sharpened, and alternatives mapped out. In a slower market, they don't need to chase. They can compare. They can wait. And because they're not rushed, they negotiate from calm certainty instead of adrenaline. Their strength isn't speed, it's optionality. Patient operators sit between these two groups: investors, relocators, long-term planners. They understand that markets don't reward bold predictions, they reward alignment. When behavior shifts, these operators reduce noise and increase signal. They track what closes, not what lists. They watch how deals fail, not how listings perform online. That patience gives them leverage without aggression. What connects these groups is not confidence in outcomes, but comfort with uncertainty. They don't need the market to feel good before acting. They need it to feel readable. Transparency matters more than optimism here. Clean disclosures, clear pricing logic, flexible terms. These elements rebuild trust when speed no longer does. This is why adaptation isn't concession, it's elevation. The people who adapt first aren't giving up value. They're preserving choice. They move before urgency replaces clarity. They decide before emotion takes over. And because of that, they keep control while others wait for reassurance that never arrives. The market hasn't become hostile, it has become selective. It favors those who respond to how buyers think now, not how they used to behave. Adaptation is not about doing more. It's about doing less, better, and earlier. If you recognize yourself here, you're not behind, you're ahead. You're adjusting while others are still interpreting silence as strength. Subscribe. Clarity beats urgency now. This moment rewards composure. It invites you to slow perception, sharpen judgment, and act without theatrics. While others wait for headlines or validation, adaptive participants quietly shape outcomes. They don't win by predicting the future. They win by staying aligned with the present, where leverage still responds to clarity, calm, prepared, attentive, patient, realistic, grounded, deliberate. One of the most dangerous assumptions homeowners make is believing this behavior will snap back the moment conditions improve. That buyers are simply waiting, temporarily cautious, and that urgency will return as soon as rates ease or headlines soften. But behavior shaped by experience doesn't reverse on command. Once people learn a new rule works, they don't forget it quickly. Buyers have learned that patience protects them. They've seen listings sit. They've watched sellers adjust quietly. They've experienced leverage without rushing. That lesson didn't come from theory or media narratives. It came from lived experience. And experience-based conditioning is far more durable than any single market cycle. This is why hoping for buyer urgency to return is a strategic mistake. Urgency is emotional. Patience is learned. When buyers discover they don't need to compete to secure options, that realization becomes part of their decision-making identity. Even when conditions improve, the memory remains. They remember that waiting didn't punish them. It rewarded them. This shift isn't driven by fear. It's driven by competence. Buyers now understand timelines, leverage, and optionality in ways they didn't before. They've been trained by the market itself. That training doesn't disappear because rates move or inventory tightens slightly. It lingers as instinct. Markets often mistake silence for temporary hesitation. In reality, silence is adaptation settling in. Buyers aren't frozen, they're calibrated. They move when alignment appears, not when pressure mounts. Sellers waiting for emotional urgency are waiting for a behavior that no longer feels rational to the people they're relying on. This doesn't mean markets won't move again. They will. But movement won't look like the past. It will be slower, cleaner, more selective. Buyers will still act, but on their terms. Those terms are shaped by what they've already learned works. The quiet warning here isn't collapse. It's misalignment. Sellers planning for yesterday's buyer risk missing today's one entirely. Not because demand vanished, but because psychology evolved. Future outcomes will favor those who adapt to this permanence instead of resisting it. Buyer behavior doesn't reset with cycles. It accumulates. Each phase leaves residue. This one leaves patience. Stay with us. This behavior shift lasts longer than cycles. The market hasn't turned against homeowners. That idea is comforting, but it's also misleading. What has actually happened is quieter and more important. The market has turned away from old assumptions, from the belief that attention equals demand, from the belief that time is neutral, from the belief that buyers will eventually behave the way they used to. When those assumptions stop working, it can feel personal, even unfair, but it isn't. It's structural. Homeowners who stay in control during periods like this aren't faster or louder. They're more observant. They watch what buyers do, not what they say. They notice how long decisions take, how often conversations stall, how rarely urgency appears. They don't panic when activity feels soft. They don't celebrate when it looks busy. They stay grounded in behavior, because behavior reveals reality before numbers ever do. This is the real divide forming in the market right now. Not winners and losers. Observers and reactors. Observers and reactors. Observers adjust early, calmly, while options are still open. Reactors wait for confirmation, then feel rushed when it finally arrives. The difference isn't courage or intelligence, it's orientation. One group listens for subtle signals, the other waits for noise. If you're watching your local market closely, you're already seeing this. Buyers who circle back weeks later, listings that attract interest but not commitment, sellers who feel confused rather than threatened. None of that means something is broken. It means the rules changed quietly. Noticing that early is an advantage, not a warning. I'd encourage you to look at your own market through this lens. Pay attention to timelines, not headlines. To hesitation, not hype. Share what you're seeing where you live, because patterns become clearer when they're compared, not when they're faced alone. That shared awareness is how uncertainty becomes manageable. In the next video, we'll talk about how time eventually forces price, without panic, without headlines, and without drama. How markets resolve pressure slowly, not suddenly. Stay subscribed. This cycle rewards the prepared. It doesn't ask you to predict outcomes or choose sides. It simply asks you to stay awake to what's changing beneath the surface. Control doesn't come from certainty. It comes from awareness held early enough to matter, when decisions still feel chosen, not forced by time. That is the quiet advantage most homeowners overlook until it's gone, and why noticing now changes everything later for good measure.